I commend this to the House.
Claire Curran.
Mr Chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak in the committee stages of the Television New Zealand Amendment Bill, to which Labour is fundamentally opposed. Last week, and I want to talk, Mr Chair, about public interest, the public interest, which is an extremely important principle which underpins our opposition to this bill. The principle of doing away with the Television New Zealand Charter and getting rid of Television New Zealand, stopping New Zealand from having a public broadcasting television station. We're leaving us in a situation where New Zealand and Mexico appear to be the only ones in the OECD who don't have a public television broadcasting channel, and also freezing the funds for Radio New Zealand, which is essentially a cut. At the same time, while sweetheart deals are being done with MediaWorks, a very dodgy relationship between the government and the commercial television station, and mounting evidence that while there was a plan to keep Television New Zealand 7 going and likely merge it with Radio New Zealand, something happened to stop that, and now we're left with nothing, except the weakness of this minister in not having any real plan for public broadcasting in this country other than to get rid of it. If he did have a plan, then he's been rolled. The weakness also of the Prime Minister and ministers, as I said last week, in kowtowing to, and it's good that that the minister may be able to respond. Labour is emphatically opposed, and I've got a little story to tell today to the Minister about this, about public broadcasting, where they spend so much time with the commercial broadcasters than the taxpayer-funded broadcaster. Last week I told you about the Minister of Broadcasting had met with the Board of MediaWorks 9 times since the election. 6 of those times were last year. That's once every 2 months, and I'm still waiting for answers on what he actually talked about. Last week, I also asked the board of the Radio New Zealand, the board chair of Radio New Zealand, Mr Richard Griffin, how many times the minister had met with Radio New Zealand since the election. Twice, I was told. That's since the end of 2008. And yet Radio New Zealand is our public broadcaster, and it's had its funding frozen, and which it admits represents a cut. And it's trying its hardest to stay afloat, and you'd think that the minister would be spending more time with them and paying them more attention. And with TVNZ, we don't know how many times the minister has met with the board of TVNZ. He hasn't told us that yet, or the board of Sky. Those questions are with the minister, and we're waiting for answers. In fact, other issues that we're waiting for answers on are with the withholding of information on the business plans for TVNZ relating to TVNZ 7, and what proposals were prepared and were put to the minister around trying to keep TVNZ afloat. In a select committee a couple of weeks ago, TVNZ told me they had provided the minister with proposals around keeping TVNZ 7. Will the minister release that information? No, he won't release it, and we'll keep trying. It's called TVNZ 7 investment scenarios, and they've been withheld for commercial reasons. Now, why would that be, given the widespread public concern and the decision to discontinue funding for TVNZ 7 and the public interest issue? And the potential harm that this might cause to the whole public broadcasting environment in New Zealand. Now, you can admit and accept that it might be legitimate to withhold financial figures that might be reasonably expected to compromise TVNZ's commercial interests if they were made public. But it's difficult to make that argument with regards to TVNZ 6 and 7 if TVNZ 6, given that TVNZ 6 has already ceased operation and that the government has now announced its decision to cut TVNZ 7. So it would be interesting to hear from the Minister what he's got to say about why that information can't be made public. After all, it's difficult to argue that TVNZ or the shareholding ministers have any commercial interest in withholding information on channels that aren't going to be continued. Which brings me to another issue, as I mentioned before, about the Minister who has been spending a lot of time meeting with the board of the commercial television broadcaster and very little time meeting with the public broadcasting sector. And Mr Chair.
Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And of course we all know that MediaWorks got a $43 million loan from this government to defer its spectrum licensing payments. And this was at the time that the government was deciding to axe the Charter for Television New Zealand, of which is the central issue in this bill and is a very central public interest issue. It was also around the time that the decisions were made to freeze the funding for Radio New Zealand, which is in essence a cut to Radio New Zealand, and then to make Television New Zealand 6 go commercial, and subsequently to cut the funding for Television New Zealand 7 altogether, which leaves New Zealand with no national public television broadcaster. So I want to share a little story with you about the public interest, and it relates to this bill because the substance of what this bill does is to attack the public interest. And it's by doing away with our public television broadcaster, its charter, and make it behave as a commercial broadcaster, which is not in the public interest, which neither was in the public interest, as the Minister well knows, was giving MediaWorks a $43 million loan. And I'd like to share with you that in May 2009, the Minister for Communications and IT wrote to the Radio Broadcasters Association rejecting their request for a deferral of spectrum licence fees because there was going to be a fiscal risk to the Crown. And the Minister said he was convinced that the Crown wasn't convinced that the Crown ought to be an alternative to services. In August 2009, the Ministry of Economic Development advised the government that there had been much lobbying by MediaWorks and the Radio Broadcasters Association, including an approach to the Prime Minister, which we now all know about, recommending that a single channel of communication be used to ensure there was no risk of creating ambiguity or mixed expectations. They advised ministers in September that the MediaWorks problem was its capital structure, not its long-term viability, and there was a Deloitte's report to accompany that. There was a memo that went to Cabinet in October in 2009 that noted the urgency of a Cabinet decision on spectrum licensing deferral, which stemmed from MediaWorks' capital restructure plans. So there was no public interest issue there. And then later in September in 2009, a Cabinet paper draft noted that MediaWorks' lobbying and Treasury misgivings, because they saw the move as a policy shift, which required public finance sign-off, but they didn't spot it at the time, and they opposed the deferral. And we know that Treasury and the MED opposed the deferring of licensing and providing a loan to MediaWorks. In October, a very significant public interest issue, Mr Chair, in October 2009, a draft Cabinet paper showed that urgency was all about the arrangements with the banks for capital restructure, and Treasury advised on the risk of the Crown becoming a creditor and acting as a bank. The Cabinet decision went through in October. They approved the alternative payment arrangements despite that advice from Treasury and the MED, but then they worked out that there was a problem because under the Public Finance Act, Section 65, the deferred spectrum payments required the Minister of Finance's approval, which it hadn't got, and in order to get that approval, there was a public interest test.
Mr Chairman!
Hey, it's for me to control the House, not the member. Now, point of order has been called, I indicated, without standing up. A member may not have heard me, but to continue to talk louder is not appropriate. Point of order, Sam Lotu-Iiga.
Mr Chairman, thank you. Mr Chairman, the Speaker is talking about radio contracts that have nothing to do with this bill. And I just urge the Speaker to maybe ask her to reconsider her speech in terms of part one of this bill.
I'll listen to the member.
I think it's a bit rich coming from a member who approached the...
Order. Now look, the member must not attack another member when they make a point of order. Get up and state, I was looking for assistance, not to get people roused up. I will give the member another chance to make a point.
Happy to help, Mr Chairman. just recall that the Minister, when he made his opening remarks in respect of the committee stages of this bill, spent the first several minutes attacking the 9 years of the Labor government in a somewhat provocative and angular way, saying that it was masquerading as public television and it was covering the cracks and all sorts of other things that were really outside what an ordinary committee stage would sound like. So I would have thought, measured against that my colleague's contribution is mild indeed.
Yes. Well, I really am very much in favour of members speaking specifically to the bill, but when we deal with part one, there is a purpose of the Act, and I guess that just opens it up a little notch, and as has been pointed out, I think both sides have done that. I don't think it assists in the final determination to get too political as we go on, but I have been listening to what the member says, and as long as they can tie in those illustrations to the purpose of the Act, I think that they're marginally inside the boundary, but a bit further out than I would prefer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This issue goes directly to the public interest of cutting and axing the Charter, the Television New Zealand Charter, and the point I'm making is that under the Public Finance Act, the Minister of Finance had to sign off that loan, and there was no public interest, and what had to be found was a reason for public interest. And the facts show, and the paperwork shows quite clearly that there was a scrambling around looking for a public interest, a reason of public interest. The Minister of Communications and IT made clear that to the Minister of Finance that there was a problem. If he didn't sign it off, then the policy would be unlawful. The MED suggested that the public interest test could be met, but only on a technicality of a retraction of the deferral, avoiding the minimal risk. Now, I stress that word minimal risk of business closures and destabilisation of the broadcasting sector, which was a market rationale, not a public interest rationale. And the bigger issue was the significant risks to government credibility for licence renewals and damaging good faith with the industry, which was really all about the government's bumbling on this issue, and that they had to scramble around and find a public interest test while screwing the public interest for public broadcasting in this country.
Sue Kedgley.
Thank you.